We can all see how practical this is for our lives. And I think especially for these times that we're in, about how we really walk in faith and in works. So let's take a look at chapter 1. Would anyone want to share how they titled chapter 1 on your James at a Glance chart? Remember, it's in pencil, so it might change anyway.
Well,
I thought for chapter 1, be doers.
yes.
Okay, be doers.
Yes.
That's what mine was.
Okay, be doers. Dave, was that what you were saying?
Yep, be doers of the word. We kind of touched on that last week even.
Yeah. And now my other question for you is, when you put down a title, did you also put down the verse that you got that from?
22.
22. Okay, it's very helpful if you can put a verse or two next to your title, so it holds you accountable to scripture, so you're not just making something up because you feel something. Make sense? So always hold yourself accountable to what the word says there. Be doers of the word. Anyone have any other title for that? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what is in this chapter. Why did you say be doers of the word? And what else is in here? What else does he talk about? What's the first thing he talks about in like the first 11 verses?
Trials and testing, and how your faith is all a part of all of that, and doubting. That's what stood out to me in this chapter, is the present tense of doubting.
Good. What else does he talk about in chapter 1?
Being steadfast under trial, I thought
Okay.
was a kind of a mega theme because it's repeated so much. And that again, that was in that first half, but I thought that was repeated a lot. Steadfast in trial, what trials produce.
Mm-hmm.
He kind of segues to temptation there as a part of our trials.
Right.
And then that last section is really about the word of truth and being doers of the word of truth.
Mm-hmm. In the last couple of verses, what does he say about true religion?
It's very practical. He finishes with that. This true religion is this: to visit orphans and widows in their affliction, and to keep oneself unstained from the world.
Mm-hmm.
In 27.
Yeah. What do you see in 26 in regards to that?
Bridling the tongue.
Okay. Are we going to talk about the tongue?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's what I was talking about earlier. Chapter 1, verse 19 is the one I marked. That was quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger. And I kind of thought the next few chapters sort of flow in that order.
Yeah.
But there's a whole chapter almost on the tongue in here, which
Yeah.
I didn't realize there was a whole chapter before in James about, almost a whole chapter about that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Bridling the tongue.
Yeah. So, and we're going to get to that in a minute, but you see the introduction of the tongue in chapter 1.
Mm-hmm.
And he says, if anyone thinks he is religious and does not bridle his tongue, he deceives his heart. Okay. All right, so that's chapter 1. So do you think that it was a good title to say, be doers of the word? Yeah.
Yes.
I think so. I think it encapsulates that.
Mm-hmm. Dave, what were you going to say?
I was going to say, yes, it does. It's
Yeah. On my at a glance chart, I put be doers of the word, and then I put as a secondary title, steadfast in trials. So we have, yeah, I see I'm doing the thumbs up from Betty. But, so you can do that. So if there's a couple of topics that you think are the main topics, you can go ahead and write in your little box there, because again, this is for you. It's for you to understand. So the first half of this is about trials and temptation and being steadfast. And then the last part of it is strongly about be doers of the word. So they give you enough space, you can put a couple things in that box, right?
Mhm.
Go for it. Go for it. Again, it's just for the, when you look at that chart, you see, oh, right, this chapter is about be doers of the word and about being steadfast in trials. What about chapter 2? Anybody want to share what theme you came up with for chapter 2?
I put faith plus works. They
Oh,
don't stand alone,
Carol,
they have to
yes,
go together.
faith plus works.
Right.
That's kind of what Mary was talking about when we were talking generally about the book, about
Yes.
faith and works, not just works.
And then it equals righteousness based on verse 23.
Say faith equals righteousness with the illustration of Abraham
Yeah, so faith plus works equals righteousness.
equals righteousness. That's a good formula.
Mhm.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about why you might have chosen that title. So what's in chapter 2? What do you see that's, what are the subjects he's discussing? What's the first one he discusses in the first 7 verses?
He talks about your treatment of other people, and he contrasts obviously a well-to-do person with one who doesn't have any of that. And so he says you shouldn't be making distinctions and become judges with evil thoughts. So we tend to look down on those who maybe haven't got as much as us for whatever reason. You come up with reasons why they might, you might say they're lazy or blah, 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 or whatever. And so he's warning not to do that. You've dishonored, in verse 6 says, but you have dishonored the poor man. Are not the rich ones who are not the rich ones who oppress you and the ones who drag you into court?
Right. Partiality. Don't show favoritism.
I wrote in the margin of my scripture 2 names, Steve Harper and Rosa Parks, who were both made to go to the back of the bus because of their color. And I thought, and I think because I had just reread Steve's testimony the other day in the most recent Central News. And I wrote those 2 names just to remind myself, because we should not be making distinctions and at all, and be judgmental. Just to remind myself.
That's good. That's good. I mean, that's something that we're faced with today, especially, right?
Mm-hmm. I
Showing
thought it was very timely.
very
I
timely.
just
Yeah.
really did. Yeah.
And that's great to make application and make note of it.
I did put down the law of love and faith, going with that he addresses them as beloved brothers and sisters, and that law then helps us on these very things about treating each other equally and not showing partiality, and a whole bunch of stuff like that.
Yeah. So you're getting into verse 8.
Yeah, and then even down, he even with the work, the faith without works, being dead. I got that verse 6, but I think this whole thing about explaining that faith and love find their expression in these things. That
Mhm.
he's talking. I'm sure he could point out other things, but at the moment, these are things that evidently are important to this group of people.
Right. Who's he writing to?
The dispersed tribes.
Wives.
Okay. So it's important always to know who the letter is addressed to, because these are believers. They're Jewish believers,
Mhm.
but they seem to be having some problems.
Yeah, I was wondering, are they kind of we tend to revert back to things we know the best. So if they're new Christians, they might have a tendency to revert back to the law. That's what they know. That's what they've known all their lives. And so he's warning them, says, do you really want that? You'll be convicted under that law as transgressors. And if he says, if you're going to do that, if you fail in one point, you're accountable for all of it.
Right. Verse 11. Right.
I think too, at least for me, when I read through the whole book, but through this specifically, it to me, it speaks of what our faith really should look like. Because I think we all have preconceived notions maybe of what righteousness or faith should look like, but this spells it out for us much more clearly, so we don't have to keep guessing if we're doing it the right way.
Thank you, Shana. Good point. So Dave kind of led us into the law and being judged by the law. And talks about judgment is without mercy to one who has shown no mercy. So there's that. Mercy triumphs over judgment. Very strong verse. And then leading into this topic of faith and works. So what do you just take away, generally speaking, from these verses on faith and works?
That one without the other is dead.
Okay.
They're inseparable.
Okay, inseparable, good word.
Like that.
Yeah, I like that. And then he makes a little argument for someone might say that I have faith, but but the other one might say, well, I have works. And then he's going to give us two illustrations that he uses to make it clear about faith and works. And the first one was Abraham, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's where Heather got her, what was your formula? Faith plus works
Equals righteousness.
equals righteousness. Yeah. And then who's the second illustration about faith and works?
Rahab.
Rahab. It's because of her faith, you saw her works. So basically, faith is the outward appearance of works.
I found this example to be a little bit puzzling because we really don't know very much about Rahab's faith. She's
Right.
Obviously a legend in the scriptures, but well, I say a legend, not to say that it's not true. I don't mean it that way, but
Right.
she's infamous in scriptures, but we don't really know very much about her faith. We know about her actions and works. We don't know very much about her faith, but the implications being made here is that the writer attributes faith to her as well.
Right. And when we start looking at chapter 2, we'll dig into that a little bit more. But it is significant, like Ron was saying, that she is mentioned here as one of two examples of faith and works. So we know a lot more about Abraham's faith, but you're right, we don't know that much about Rahab's, but it was demonstrated. It was demonstrated. All right, anything else from chapter 2 before we get into the difficult one? Yeah. All right. What's the main subject of this chapter? Chapter 3.
Watch your mouth.
Watch your mouth. Is that what you titled the chapter? Watch your mouth. Like Carla was saying, really, he's dedicated an entire chapter to the topic of the tongue. What does that in itself say to you about this topic?
I think he matched it with having wisdom, tongue and wisdom.
Right, tongue and wisdom in this chapter, right. So how do those two relate to each other?
I think that sometimes I can figure out that what I'm saying doesn't match what I think I know, and that I need more wisdom from God, emanating from, spewing out of me. So that sometimes the tongue is in a temperature check.
Okay.
For using God's wisdom.
I put down be wise in speech. So that kind of combines the wisdom and the tongue together.
Be wise in speech. Wisdom and tongue. He uses some illustrations that we'll be taking a good look at when we get to chapter 3, but he uses some illustrations to show us exactly what he means by that tongue and the problem that it causes. What are the 3 illustrations?
The rudder of the ship, the forced fire.
Yep. You got them.
I have those two, so I'm missing one.
You said the ship, the horse, and the fire.
The ship and the fire.
Okay.
In the horse's
Of
mouth.
course. In
Oh,
3.
the horse's mouth. Okay, the first one was the horse's mouth. I missed that.
Okay. I think maybe you said force, and I heard you say horse.
Oh, no, the
Yeah.
fire.
Yes. So, and again, we're not going to talk about those, but when you see 3 illustrations, when you see repetition, the thing you have to ask yourself is, what is the same about these 3 things that he's trying to show us then relates to the tongue? So just as a matter of how you look at these, the question would always be, if he's giving me 3 illustrations, then what is he trying to tell me? So I look for what is the same about them. Okay, but we will do that when we get to chapter 3. So anyone else want to share a title for chapter 3?
I just put by good conduct, let him show his works. And I put verse 13.
Okay, verse 13. By his good conduct, let him show his works in the meekness of wisdom.
I figure that encompasses the tongue as part of that.
So hopefully what you're seeing is how we're reasoning through these chapters and just identifying the topics and then putting them together to say, well, what's the main point in this chapter? Just to help you get, again, a sense of the whole book. So and what I always do, and a lot of times they'll ask you to do that in the homework, is for each paragraph in the chapter, just write in the margin what that paragraph is about. Like when we talked about in chapter 2, the first verses were about partiality, showing favoritism. So again, like I just write it in the margin, partiality. So that as I look down my margin, I've got these topics, just kind of all spelled out. And then it helps you too to see then, well, how do I tie this together and come up with a title for the chapter, for the whole chapter. Okay. I mean, but it was pretty obvious, wasn't it, that he's talking about the tongue here,
Mm-hmm.
right? And the problem with that is that we all have one, right? So it's like, okay, I think I could be in trouble here sometimes. Let's then talk about chapter 4. How does this chapter begin? If you were to put a little identification in the margin for these first 7 verses, or first few verses, what is it? How does it start?
He's addressing quarrels and fights.
Right.
I don't know how this comes after chapter 3.
Oh, and he talks all about the tongue, and then he says, yeah, you causes quarrels and fights. What else does he talk about in this chapter?
Well, it kind of like touches on the 10 Commandments. I mean, he mentions a lot of them: murder, covet, adultery,
Mhm.
speaking against your neighbor, not really neighbor, but your brother.
Yeah.
Speaking evil against your brother. I mean, it's kind of, and he knows who he's talking to.
He knows who he's talking to, right? He's talking to Jewish believers who would know all of those commandments. What does he kind of give as a solution to that?
I thought it was verse 10, humble yourselves before the Lord,
Mm-hmm.
was the key instruction for me of the chapter.
Yeah.
I didn't go so far as to put that as the theme, but I think it's the solution to the central issue, which is the divisions among the people, the fighting, and also verse 7, submit yourselves therefore to God.
Yeah, and
And
verse
then draw
8.
near to God.
Mhm.
Betty, what are you saying?
Well, I just said, and verse 8. And yeah,
Oh, and
she
verse
brought
8.
that up.
Right. What else does he talk about in chapter 4?
Back to the tongue.
Mhm.
Don't speak evil of each other.
Huh?
Don't speak evil of each other.
Sure.
Oh, judging.
He points out that you can't count on tomorrow. Don't.
Okay.
That's 13.
Right. 13. Can't count on tomorrow. You don't know what it will bring. So, what is the final verse of this chapter?
If you know the right thing and don't do it, that's a sin. So the sin of omission.
Right. So just do the right thing.
Right.
That reminds me of the Sunbeam Pledge. Do right.
Yeah.
Do right. Do the right thing. So, anyone else want to? So, Carla, you talked about humble yourselves. You said you didn't put it as your chapter title, though.
No, but I thought it was, for me, one of the key instructions amid all the others.
Okay.
Humble yourselves before the Lord, to me, kind of summarize, submit, draw near,
Mm-hmm.
mourn for your sin.
Yeah. Anyone else have a title? That I actually put that. I erased my first title and put "Humble Yourselves, Lord Will Exalt" as my title. but I erased something else. I don't remember now what it was, but anyone else have any other titles for chapter 4?
Well, I kind of look at this whole thing as contrasting as being, the tendency to love. You can't be part of the world. You have to kind of divorce yourself from that. So in mine, I had friendship with the world is enmity with God, verse 4.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of liken this to the problem of like the rich young ruler. He'd like to be a follower, but he's got this conflict within him. He still has the passions for, he has a hard time giving up what he has, even though he would, he wants to be a follower. So there's that struggle. So I kind of see this chapter as kind of that struggle, resisting the devil and he will flee from you, and friendship with the world, and tending to do the things of the world, speaking evil of one another and all those kinds of things. So that's why I kind of grouped it under that heading.
Actually, that's the title I erased, now that you say that.
Oh.
That's what I had put first, was friendship with the world is enmity with God. So that's the things, like the more you look at it and think about it and just see how does it all work together. So
I think what you're saying, Linda, is really true. Is the issue is I'm making this list so when I'm thinking about this book, these are hangers that I can just hang this on to give me a reminder, and then the other stuff will come up once.
exactly. That's the whole point of an overview. Okay, let's get to chapter 5, because that's the one Heather had a problem with. So we'll see if we can help her out with that. Chapter 5. What are the topics? What's the first topic he talks about?
See, it was about to be patient until the Lord comes.
Okay, be patient
Verse
until
7.
the Lord comes. Is that your chapter theme?
That was part of it.
Okay.
Have be patient, remain steadfast, and pray.
Okay.
About judgment of the rich.
Okay. Yeah, at the very beginning, he's talking about judgment of the rich.
Kind of a continuation of 4, where, like being of the world, these things are, the world is going to be a fleeting thing. Your riches, are going to corrode, your garments are going to be moth-eaten and all that. There's nothing lasting about that.
Thank you for connecting those two, Dave. Connecting chapter 4 with the world, with the rich, because again, it's like Sue was saying earlier, when you hear it just read, you catch the flow more. But when your eyes see a division between chapter 4 and chapter 5, then you sometimes disassociate those. But it just flows, it all flows together. It's not a really good picture of rich people and the character of them.
But it does put in perspective, and Jeannie kind of alluded to it in the chat, does put in perspective that it's not ours to judge. It's the end judgment that is going to happen, not earthly judgment. We sometimes want, well, I won't stop preaching. I was going to say we sometimes want to do the judgment right now.
Yeah, I missed her chat, but I'm looking at it now. Yeah, there's too many things for me to look at on this screen. Yeah, but that's true, and that's like be patient until the coming of the Lord, who is the judge. Right? He is the judge. He will be the one to judge. So just be patient until he takes over that role. What other topics are there in the chapter?
Prayer.
Prayer. Yep.
Mhm.
So how about the theme? Betty already shared her theme, a 3-part. Could you repeat that, Betty?
Yes, be patient, remain steadfast, and pray.
Okay. Anyone else have a theme they would like to share with sum up chapter 5?
Lump all 3 of those under the general heading of, I picked up on the last part, or the middle part of verse 8, establish your hearts. So and those things that Betty just said are the things you do to establish your heart.
Dave, you and I are on the same page today, because I had something else, and then I saw that establish your hearts for the coming of the Lord. And I'm like, it's more than just being patient for the coming of the Lord, but establish your hearts. Anyone else?
When I look at that same verse in chapter 5, and I look at it in other translations, the word stand firm, pops out, and it's an active word. Sometimes when we think about being patient, you think of that almost being passive. You're just enduring. But standing firm is intentionality and will. And so I think this is what God expects for us, particularly during the troubled times. We've got to gird our loins up, so to speak, stand firm.
That's good. Establish means stand firm. Is that what you were saying, Catherine?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, stand firm.
Be firm. And then the question is, stand firm against what? So obviously there are things that's happening. We've already looked at them in this book where they are being persecuted by the rich men there. So yeah, stand firm. I like that active versus passive. So go ahead.
This is Janie. Okay, so my theme for chapter 5 was to fix your treasure in heaven, because that kind of dictates how you act with everything else. Like when you're focused on heaven, then you're not really grumbling or complaining about what you have here. And when you're having all of your treasure there, then that's what you're fixing your eyes on heaven, right? So everything here just kind of fades, and it doesn't really have as much of importance as the internal impact. So.
Mm-hmm. Good. See, and again, these titles are all about how you see it and how you can describe it. Like she just described that. So to just put, what did you say? Treasure in heaven. Just to put that down without being able to give reasons for it, would not be useful. So when she looks at that, this is what she thinks about. When you look at your title, then it's what do you think about with these subjects? Okay. You're processing, you're reasoning scripture. Did anyone think about, I asked you last week to think about what actually made James sit down and write the book? What was his purpose for writing? Anybody get that far in your reasoning?
I just came across, the thing that came across for me is he loved them. That he calls them beloved, and he really cared about them. And he had gone through experiences before they had, and was willing to share his walk on the road.
I think he wrote it to encourage them to remain steadfast. Here are the pitfalls. This is what you have to do to remain steadfast. He gave lots of examples, but this is how you remain steadfast.
Good.
Yeah, I could see he had a lot of sympathy for them, knowing that, you know, the situation they were in, you know, here living with the Gentiles, and like what was said before, having grown up under the law and trying to balance all of that. They're kind of, I think in James' perspective, they're like kind of baby Christians maybe, and he's trying to give them some guidance of how they can grow.
Good. It's just good to think about this big picture. It's good to kind of put yourself in their place and look at them, you know, in a real life situation, where they are, what they're doing, what they have known from the past, what they're, you know, what James is trying to help them understand. So it's just good to not read it as a history book, but to read it as real life people going through these things, and what is James doing to help them. And then, of course, the question is, how does that help us? That's the whole point of us doing these studies. How is that going to help us? So if you look at your at a glance chart, did you write down who the author was?
Yeah.
It's pretty obvious, right?
Yeah.
James, and then who the recipients are? 12 tribes, so they're Jewish believers. His purpose, you may have written something down there. You may, at this point, say, I'm not sure about his purpose for writing.
So Linda, when you're talking about the recipients, why does he focus on just the 12 tribes? He ignores all the non-Jews.
He ignores who?
All the non-Jewish people.
Oh, the non-Jewish people. And I think that's because he's writing to believers. So these are specific problems that the believers are facing, and the Jews, he's talking to them in the dispersion, so they have been scattered. So that's another part of it. Because they're scattered, they're not all together in Jerusalem and supporting each other. So he's trying to give them some help, but he's speaking just strictly to believers at this point.
We know a time frame on this. Is this an earlier letter, or would this be before Paul's letters, or where
Some
that?
people, let me just find my note on that. Could have been written in AD 45 to 49. So some think that James was the first letter of the New Testament to be written.
So at that stage, the church did emanate from those Jewish believers, and then Paul opened up the door.
Mm-hmm.
So I wonder, Wes, if that has something to do with it.
That it's the very early church.
Yeah, that timing makes more sense.
Yeah.
Well, I think, I think we don't like to think in these terms in this day and age, but the reality was, in the New Testament, a time period, there were distinct ministries to distinct sets of people, even among the apostles. Some were concentrating on that Jewish remnant that had been reached, and others were, as Paul did, felt commissioned to go to talk to the Greeks. And so there were different ministries depending on that were taking place, addressing things from the perspective of their current culture.
And going back to the bigger picture, just want to say too that the Jews were the people that God chose to represent him to the unbelievers. And so when he takes them out of Egypt and establishes them as a nation and cultivates this, and he's trying to make them into the people who will represent him so that non-believers can see who he is. So I think at this point, and this is just my own speculations, but that you've got to get the Jewish people together on the same page, and understanding that the law is no longer what they live by, but they live, by faith in Christ. So you got to get them on that page so that they can then represent when Paul is sent out to the Gentiles.
But you also have to have an address to send this letter, so he knows those people, so he'll send it to their address.
That's practical. Yes. Yes. So it's a good question, because all it says in that first verse is to the 12 tribes in the dispersion. So that's all it says. So it's good to be thinking about, well, what does that mean? And why is he just writing to them? Good. So you, and then you're listing your key words. So we wrote down, we looked at 4 key words in this lesson: faith, doer or works, the word, and judge. Did you add any other keywords to your list as you read through? Just words that, again, a keyword is a word that's repeated and is essential to the text. It identifies a subject.
I added trials/trust or tests.
Yep. Yep, those are the 2 that I added as well. They were very obvious, right? So looking at your chapter themes, if you just look down it, do you see a flow of the book that you can say, oh, I see where this is going?
Mm-hmm.
Is it helpful like that? Good. All right. So we've done a great job of looking at the big picture of James, the overview, a lot of good insight, a lot of good reasoning of scripture. We've got a great start. And next week, we will be doing lesson 2, which will be on chapter 1. And we're going to just start digging in, like Carla was saying, like to do a deep dive into it and see how it's going to impact our lives. Okay. So again, if you have any questions when you start doing that, especially those of you who are newer, just send me an email. I'll have lots of time in Colorado to write you back. Okay. All right. Good. Then we'll see you next week on Zoom. And stay in touch and stay safe.
Thank you.
Thanks, Linda.
Linda.
Thank you, Linda. Have a safe trip.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.